Undrafted rookie free agency is a process that's been very good to the Detroit Lions over the years, granting them players like Jerry Jacobs, Brock Wright, Brandon Joseph, Lauren Strickland, and Maurice Norris, who are all valuable members of the Detroit Lions roster who began their career as undrafted rookie free agents. It is a group that likely won't ever result in an All-Pro or a Pro Bowler or even $100 million contract, but they are valuable pieces to this team. They are quality backups, quality football players, and help the Detroit Lions manage the cap space to make sure they can sign their larger veteran players. And today, we're going to take a look at the Detroit Lions' most recent undrafted rookie free agency class, a group of 9 players that didn't quite go in the NFL draft, but the Detroit Lions felt were good enough to make the preseason roster and try out for the opportunity to be part of the final 53 in week 1. And today, we're going to take a look at each and every one of those players in depth, talk about their chances of making the roster, the role that they may play, and overall, just take a look at their opportunities to become Detroit Lions. So, with that being said, let's take a look at him. Starting off with Anthony Tyus. The running back from Ohio stands at 6'1", 215 pounds. A bit more of a bruising back than the Detroit Lions are typically accustomed to, could find a role for goal line work in short yardage situations. But, of course, with the depth the Lions have at running back, his road to a starting spot is quite murky. Jackson Meeks, the wide receiver from Syracuse, is nephew to former Detroit Lions pass rusher Zadarius Smith. With over 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns in his final year at Syracuse, he was the true #1 weapon for an ACC power. But with his limited production throughout college and limited athletic traits, he also has a long road to go before he ends up making this roster. Ian Kennelly, safety from Grand Valley State University, comes from a significantly smaller school than a majority of his draft classmates. But as we have seen in the past, Grand Valley State, which is right down the road from Detroit, has produced NFL talent in the past. Players like Matt Judon have made a Pro Bowl and even an All-Pro in their career, so the small school is far from an ending for an NFL pathway and an NFL career. Mason Miller, NDSU alumni, a player that stands at 6'7" with fantastic size for the tackle position. However, of course, going to a smaller school, that is going to limit his opportunity to be scouted, to be tracked, and really be seen by NFL general managers. But they have put a lot of offensive linemen into the NFL over the years, including Gray Zabel, a first-round pick from this most recent class. So, being a small school, much like Grand Valley State, is far from an ending to their career. Caden Prieskorn grew up a local Michigan kid before committing to Memphis, going to Ole Miss for the final 2 years of his career, being a productive tight end in the SEC. Standing at 6'6" and being a great vertical threat for an offense, I think he has one of the best opportunities to make this roster with the limited depth they have at tight end. You could take a look at Jacobi James, the wide receiver from UMass. Only 1 season of collegiate production, but ran a 4.35 40-yard dash at 6'1". He is an athletic freak who put up great numbers and really had a phenomenal season for a smaller program like the University of Massachusetts. Keith Cooper, an underwhelming defensive lineman from Houston, but with good size and good power, could potentially compete in a weak edge rushing room. Gavin Holmes, defensive back from Texas, often got overlooked by his teammates, but is a player that had production early in his career and, of course, was able to start as a defensive back for the University of Texas, an SEC power. He potentially could end up making this roster as a back-end secondary player and special teams contributor. And then you have Leaf Fatanu, the center from Arizona State, who put up pretty good numbers in his final season. Of course, helped the Demons go to the college football playoff, was a big part of the success that Cam Scadaboo saw at Arizona State, and could potentially, again, make the roster with the Detroit Lions not having a very clear backup plan to Frank Ragnow in the retirement of Graham Glasgow. So, with that being said, let's take a look a little bit more in depth of these prospects, starting off with Anthony Tyus, a player that was really good with the University of Ohio, a 6'1", 215-pound running back who last season saw 237 carries, 1,215 yards, and 9 touchdowns on the ground. Now, before his senior season at Ohio, he was primarily a backup running back at the University of Northwestern, a Big Ten school that really hasn't seen a ton of success over the last couple of seasons. And after 3 seasons of sitting the bench and seeing limited carries, Tyus decided to transfer, went to a MAC school, and was named a second-team All-MAC running back while leading the conference in rushing yards. On top of that, he is a very powerful player, has good contact balance, isn't super fast, but is quite agile for his size, and I do think is going to have a lot of good opportunities in the preseason. I don't see guys like Jahmyr Gibbs or Craig Reynolds or, of course, David Montgomery getting a lot of looks in the preseason, which means I think it's going to come down to a lot of Sione Vaki. I think we're going to see a lot of Anthony Tyus, and he's going to get an opportunity to show what he can do. Now, with the Detroit Lions running back room already being quite deep, with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery being cemented, Sione Vaki and Craig Reynolds feeling pretty comfortable, there won't be a whole lot of opportunity for Tyus to make the roster. He's likely going to be battling with Jamar Jefferson for a spot at the practice squad, but even if an undrafted rookie free agent makes the practice squad, that is a good sign for their career and a great opportunity for them to start and stick with an NFL roster. Kai Robichaux is another player on this list that could potentially find opportunities in the preseason. The 6-foot even 215-pound running back from Boston College saw 338 carries in his 2 seasons with BC, totaling over 1,500 yards, 18 touchdowns through his career. He's a player that also transferred as a junior, wasn't seeing a lot of opportunity with his original collegiate program, so transferred to the ACC and was one of the ACC's best running backs over the last 2 years. With 1,500 yards and 18 touchdowns, he was a massive part of BC's success on the ground, was a good player for them over the last couple of seasons, is again more of a power back, more of a short yardage player at the end of his collegiate career, but a player that does have a lot of carries, does have a lot of experience, and could potentially see some goal line work in the preseason for Detroit. And even if he doesn't stick with the roster, does have the opportunity to impress teams enough to get signed elsewhere, either to a practice squad or to the bottom of a final 53. He's a good volume back, high touchdown percentage. He's a tough runner, is not afraid to grind things out through the tackles and in the middle of a chaotic offensive line. But again, I think he lacks the playmaking ability. I think he lacks the big play potential that the Lions really like in their running backs, and therefore I think limits his potential to effectively make this roster. However, I do think he'll get a lot of opportunities in the preseason, so who knows? He might make a couple touchdowns, might have 3 or even 4 touchdowns in the preseason, and at that point, it's really hard to ignore and deny a player like Kai Robichaux. Jacobi James, a very unique player to this list, and a player that, had the Detroit Lions not selected 2 wide receivers in the NFL draft, I feel like could end up making this roster. Standing at 6'1", 195 pounds, he finished his collegiate season with 50 receptions, 839 yards through the air, and 6 touchdowns. He ran a 4.35 40-yard dash at his NFL Pro Day and has a lot to really like. He has a ton of speed, he has yak ability, he has good size, he was productive, and he was even a player that put up over 100 yards and a touchdown against the University of Georgia when the 2 programs met this previous season. He is a player that shows up in big moments. He's a player that was by far their most effective weapon at the University of Massachusetts, but of course, going to a smaller school and a program that didn't win a lot of games, it's going to limit his exposure and opportunity to get seen. He is, I think, better than a lot of the wide receivers that were drafted in the NFL draft, but with the wide receiver room already being quite deep with St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Tim Patrick, Khalif Raymond, Isaac Tesla, and of course Dominic Lovett, he's going to be competing likely for wide receiver 7. He may be able to beat out Lovett for wide receiver 6, but I don't think he brings the same special teams versatility that Lovett can bring to a roster, which again is going to hurt his chances, even if he's a better pure wide receiver than Lovett is. Is he going to make a roster? I do think so. I think he'll either make a practice squad or a roster and will have the opportunity to play for an NFL team. However, with the way the Detroit Lions are structured, I'm not sure that NFL team will be located in Detroit. I think a very similar thing goes for Jackson Meeks, a player that a lot of people are really excited to hear about. Syracuse wide receiver sitting at 6'1", 205 pounds with 78 receptions, 1,021 yards, and 7 touchdowns in his final collegiate season. The Lions and a lot of the NFL had a 6th round grade on Jackson Meeks. And how do we know that? Well, he got the largest guaranteed signing bonus of any undrafted free agent in this class. A signing bonus of $200,000 guaranteed means that they believe that he could potentially make this roster and contribute at some point throughout his career. Now, I think Jackson Meeks is a good football player. He adjusts to the ball very well. He has strong hands. doesn't really separate a ton, but does have a tough after the catch ability. He's able to run, he's able to create yards after contact, and he is able to create something out of nothing. But his separation really didn't stand out to me. A lot of his highlights and a lot of his big plays came from back shoulder throws, came from high pointing the football, came from really tough contested catches. And all those things are certainly impressive. He has great body control, really good hands, late hands to go catch the football so the DB can't get involved. He has a lot of good traits to be an NFL wide receiver, but separation really isn't one of them. Despite the production in college, I don't necessarily believe he will end up being a Detroit Lions wide receiver again, because I don't necessarily think he fits what their play style likes. They like separators. They like guys that can create a lot of space between themselves and the defensive back. And I just don't think that Jalen Meeks is one of those players that can particularly do that at a high level. Do I think he can make a roster? Absolutely. Do I think he can make the Detroit Lions roster? I do, but he'll have to have a very impressive preseason and show he can contribute on special teams, something he did do at Georgia, much like Dominic Lovett. But I do think his road is quite a bit tougher than some of the other players because he's playing at such a unique position that the Detroit Lions are particularly well off at. Mason Miller, a 6'7" right tackle from the University of North Dakota State, is another player that got a signing bonus, $20,000 guaranteed and a $10,000 signing bonus. He is the newest member of the NDSU pipeline to the NFL. He is big, he is strong, he is powerful, he's really good in pass protection, and I think he does have some good competition. Of course, Gray Zabel was a player selected in the first round of the NFL draft, so that small school doesn't necessarily mean you're not a quality player, but the inability to really track himself against some top-tier competition in this draft class did really hurt him throughout the process. Again, he's 6'7", he's big, he's powerful, he's a solid pass protector, didn't give up many sacks, and was a pretty solid run blocker at North Dakota State. I think he's going to get an opportunity at right tackle this offseason alongside Giovanni Manu, and I think the best player is going to win, and I think one of them will end up making the roster. Again, it is going to be a tough battle for him to make it with Giovanni Manu and Dan Skipper already on the roster, but I do think the opportunity will be there, and if he shows out, who knows? He may end up making the practice squad or could even end up sneaking on as a final player with the 53. However, the one player that I look at that potentially I think really has an opportunity to crack this roster for Detroit, and the player that I would put my money on to make the roster is Caden Prieskorn, a player that grew up a Detroit Lions fan, grew up in the southern part of the state of Michigan, a player that played his high school ball in Michigan and eventually moved out to Memphis to start his collegiate career before transferring to Ole Miss and becoming a really big part and a staple of that Ole Miss Rebels offense. A tight end that stands at 6'6", 215 pounds, and over the last 2 seasons had 57 receptions, 850 yards, and 7 touchdowns through the year. He signed a $60,000 guaranteed contract with $15,000 as part of his signing bonus. He is a player the Lions put the second most capital into an undrafted rookie free agency. And when you take a look at this Detroit Lions tight end room, there is room to break through. There is room for him to make this roster, and I do think he's going to have the opportunity to do so. At 6'6", 215 pounds, he is a big field stretcher. He has great size, great ability to separate down the field, and is a willing blocker. Is he the best at it? Absolutely not. He is not a good enough blocker to necessarily consider that to be one of his greatest skills, but he is a player that is willing to get in the way. He's willing to throw a block. He's willing to do what he can to make an impact even when the ball isn't in his hands, even if it's not the biggest contributing factor to his success. Now, with the Detroit Lions tight end room, of course, Sam Laporta is fantastic and Brock Wright is a solidified veteran. But behind that, it's Shane Zylstra, who's been really injury-prone the last couple of years. It's Kayode Yabude, a player that was just signed from the New York Jets, but is more of a blocking tight end. So if the Detroit Lions and John Morgan want to bring in more of a field stretcher to pair with Sam Laporta, I do think Caden Prieskorn is a perfect opportunity to do that. I think the role is there for him to snatch on the Detroit Lions offense, and the depth isn't there for other players like Jackson Meeks, who has to fight through 6, 7, 8 wide receivers, right? Whereas Mason Miller might have to fight through 4, 5 tackles to get on the roster. I think Caden Prieskorn has a pretty good look at this roster. I think he can very much beat out a guy like Shane Zylstra. I think he can very much beat out a guy like Yabude from the Jets, and a player that probably won't start, right? Won't be a big contributor year one, but a guy that, you know, if Sam Laporta misses some time, if a guy like Brock Wright misses some time, another undrafted free agent who ended up making this roster, one of the more successful ones, I think he's a player that could step in and make a big role. He is big. He is productive. He did play in the SEC. There are a lot of tools and a lot of reasons to believe that Caden Prieskorn could potentially be a good player. But again, undrafted free agents do have a tendency to flame out. Not all of them make the roster, and in fact, very few of them end up even becoming active members. But I think if one player is going to do it, it will be Caden Prieskorn. So with all that being said, that is my take on the Detroit Lions undrafted free agency class. 9 players among them. I think all of them have an opportunity to make the practice squad or another roster across the NFL. But just with the talent and with the depth the Detroit Lions have, I think only one truly stands out as a potential player to impact the roster this season. But let me know down in the comments below. What do you think about this class? Do you think guys like Jackson Meeks or some of the other players have a chance to make it and play well in the preseason? Let me know down in the comments below your opinions on what players are most and least likely to make this roster when the preseason is all said and done. But with that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. If you've yet to subscribe to the channel, please go down below and do so. Helps the channel out a ton. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions!